Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Crime Centric. This being a show where it's about crime dramas that I watch. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the latest episode of Under the Banner of Heaven. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. Well, first and foremost, we have Jeb making his way up to the area where Bill was, just to make sure that he's okay. And luckily, he is, but obviously, they ended up finding, what was her name, Jenny. She's Sam and Sarah's daughter. She kind of gives them a little insight. Honestly, that little girl, like, the way that actress delivered those lines, I was just like, I don't know, seeing her like that, and just the way she was kind of like, every time she was talking, she was like choking back her tears and stuff. It's like, it makes you kind of, it breaks your heart. But finding out her dad's in there with a whole bunch of his other kids, and obviously learning the dynamics of, she hasn't seen her Uncle Alan nor her Aunt Brenda in a while. The only time they see each other is in special occasions, because I'm assuming it's just kind of like Ron and his family, where it's like they don't see eye to eye about all this. I mean, Ron's already distanced himself a little bit from the rest of the family already. We still don't know where the lines in the sand are drawn. We know where Dan stands. Him, Robin, and Sam are all on the same side. We just don't know where Ron stands in this, and Alan, they're both kind of on their own to some extent, but they're still neck deep in all of this. So Jeb was reluctant to go full, like, oh, let's kind of go full frontal assault on this, because he talks about their history. And once again, I know nothing about Mormonism, and so this is kind of a history lesson for me. I mean, I think there's been persecution amongst every religion at some point in time. It's just how the world works. But to know, like, they were massacred, that, you know, that's why Jeb was reluctant to go at the cabin, because he's like, right, this Sam might see this as that particular massacre, because they went up to the log cabin, stuck all their rifles through, lit everybody up. The only survivor were 3 children, and they still put them down, because it was a metaphor that they used, kind of comparing them to, like, lice. I think it's just a thing of, you leave one alive and they'll spread like the plague type of thing. So, straight up executed a child. All 3, in fact. I was like, that's next level. But it's the thing of, like, right, we can't let them spread. And it seemed like it came out of nowhere. But events later on, discussions later on in the episode kind of hint that, no, it wasn't just out of nowhere. It's just things kept building and building and building until, like, it doesn't, like, not trying to justify that massacre, but it seems like they were prompted by other means. Because later on, Alan talks about, the fact is that, what was it, Jonathan Smith was not all about the violence or whatever. He didn't want to kind of go to war. He didn't want to use violence. It's like, that's not our way. His wife, he sided with his wife Emma on that. But after he was in jail and then he escaped from prison, his heart shifted, and he's like, right, if we have to, we'll spill their blood and rather than letting them spill ours. Now, whether it was by Jonathan's orders or one of his people got so radicalized they went off on his own and did this, but they killed, like a governor or something. They killed someone higher up. So you're like, right, that must have been the jump off point for the massacre. To be fair, there was bad blood back and forth. Not so more so on the Mormon side. Like, they were retaliating because of the way they'd been treated time and time again. But I think that's what that's supposed to signify, that killing of that official is what jump-started that massacre, I think. Or at least, maybe there's still gaps in that. We're still not figuring out that maybe that one death wasn't that triggered all of this. Maybe, in fact, there was others, but that's the only one we focus on this episode. Luckily, Jeb was able to convince Sam, like, right, put down your arms, but even then he wasn't willing to. So they bust in there, got Sam. Someone ran away, and I don't know if that was, I would assume that was either Ron or Dan, because now you see that with the full-grown beard that he is, one of the pioneers that people saw when it came to this whole thing was, it had to be Sam. And so now 3 of the brothers are locked up, while, once again, you still got 2 in the wind, that being Ron and Dan. They're the ones still in. Oh no, 3, because I keep forgetting about Jacob. We also don't know where he falls in on all of this, but part of me wonders, is it going to be set up that Jacob's the one that did it? Because he was like, he's the quiet one that Brenda was really nice to, but he might be the one that became so radicalized that he thought he was doing the right thing or something. I don't know. Maybe it's just kind of a thing of like, you show me some kindness, and maybe he misconstrued that, and so he ends up killing her because of it. I don't know. I do keep forgetting about Jacob. So there are half the siblings are still in the wind. So that could have easily been the one that ran away. I'm thinking Ron, because the hair looked a little darker, like brownish. So I'm assuming it was either Ron or, because Jacob's hair is like, well, at least in the past, it was kind of like shorter, kind of almost buzzed down. So it might just, I mean, for all we know, it might have grown out in this time. So he might have a beard and everything too, but I was leaning more towards Ron. So we'll see. And once again, I think it's such a fascinating thing where, once again, someone like Jeb, who is so religious, now is starting to see kind of the darker side of his religion. Like, he's starting to, like, wow, like, because he even says, like, there are things I've never heard of. He's like, I've heard whispers about some of this, but he's never heard so much detail about some of, like, the darker side. And it's one of those things of, shh, don't talk about it. He went to the bishop and it's like, right, you're going to get your children baptized. And he asked the bishop, first and foremost, he talks to the bishop about his mom's circumstances because she wandered off on her own because she's got dementia and it freaked him out. Luckily, Rebecca was there to kind of, and everyone in the community came together to help look for her. So everyone was happy she came back home and everything was all right. Because the bus driver was like, hey, I recognized her from the church. Where she wanted to go is where she used to live. But my bus route doesn't go that far, so I brought her back. So it's like, it's that thing of like, oh, man, it's a beautiful thing. Back when neighbors knew each other. Like, oh, I know her from church. And so there's a beautiful thing to it. And I think that's supposed to be the parallels I draw. Like, oh, man, there's a beautiful aspect to this community, being, LDS and stuff. But there is the, and don't, every religion has their dark sides, both in the past and present day. You also have the whole situation of, every religion has their extremists who kind of will give a religion a bad name, both past and present wise. But, first and foremost, he's like, right, he doesn't know what to do about his mom because Jeb's like, my mom, for the first time, she was like lucid for the first time in a long time. He also talked about the fact is like, right, at the time he took his mom in about 10 years ago, him and Rebecca hadn't had any children. His brothers are like, oh yeah, they have like 8-10 children of their own. And I'm like, oh, that must make you feel weird because it must like, oh, you only have 2 kids? What's wrong with you? So, I mean, but I guess it's like, right, they saw it as a miracle that they do have 2 children in all. Maybe it eventually would want more, but circling back to it, with her in the condition she's in, and in that moment, her being like, she doesn't want to be here anymore. In a moment of lucidity, she says she doesn't want to be here anymore. But the bishop is like, no, ending a life before its time, like that's God's decision for when a life should end. Cutting it short is kind of going against God's plan. But it says there is medication, because I think certain religions don't kind of frown upon modern like medicine and stuff, don't they? Maybe I'm making that up. But what was interesting was when he said like, right, so women, they can't control their feelings. You're like, okay, and you could tell that like Jeb was almost like, wait, what? He didn't say anything, but he's like, huh? And he's like, yeah, women, they have a hard time controlling their emotions than men, and they need to be medicated. I mean, most of the women that are part of this congregation are medicated. I'm like, yeah, but is that by choice, or is that like severe like pressure from their husbands? Like, oh, honey, it leans into that stereotype of, oh, you're acting like a hysterical woman, and you're like, ugh. And you can tell Jeff, once again, it's like, wait, has my religion always been like this? Like, once again, it's like, I think this particular bunch is kind of the more extremism of it, but it's like, right, you don't know. The point of history is to learn from your mistakes, because if you don't learn about history, you're doomed to repeat it. And so many aspects of their past are coming back. And now Jeb's like, right, I can understand why you would go down the routes you have, because this is kind of been integrated. This has been a part of our religion for such a long time that it's been kept quiet. Why? Because it's an ugly history that no one... I mean, I'm sure there's plenty of countries and stuff that try to bury their respective histories because it's like, no, let's not talk about that. Oh, like, because every country's got like their super dark and effed up history. They're probably like, yeah, don't talk about that. And religions are probably the same way. So hearing that perspective from the bishop, it just kind of like bothered Jeb. And now he's even talking to Rebecca like, maybe we should postpone the baptisms. And Rebecca's response is so fascinating, where it's like, no, 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 no. Do you know what that's going to do to our children? Because it's going to make it seem like they failed their interview. It's going to be humiliating for them, for us. It's because it's all about reputation, because you're literally living in a predominantly Mormon community. And so it's like, oh, whoa, 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 they didn't get baptized. What's wrong with them? And they're going to be kind of the shame, the people you look down upon. Like, there's all, like, no matter where we go, we will always get those stink eyes. We'll always like have people whispering and murmuring about our family. Like, oh, maybe they're not good with God. Oh, their children. Maybe those parents, they failed in some shape or form. God isn't smiling upon them. It's that type of energy. And so I can understand where Rebecca's coming from, but also at the same time, it's like, it's just interesting that that's what you're most concerned about. To be fair, Jeb didn't tell her why he had issues with it. Like, he had been a little bit more open because his conversations with Alan have been starting to slowly open his eyes, and now he's starting to see things from a different lens. Because when you're so inundated in something, you can never have, and I thought it was interesting because Alan was like, right, wives can have a clearer picture of their husbands than their husbands can have of themselves. I think that's applicable to a lot of people. Like, sometimes you won't always have the clearest, your view of yourself will always be biased. You know, having a third party kind of being the examiner in that can be helpful because it can broaden your perspective. And Jeb has had a very narrow viewed perspective for so long, but now that point of view is starting to widen. Not enough that he opens up to his wife about it, because it's like, right, they're already a part of this and everything, so it's not really something he wants to concern her about. Which, you know, he has to play I'm the man of the house, so you have to listen to me. He's like, I want you to be on my side, but you know that's kind of got to come back to him later on. And like, I kind of had to pull that card. He was like, I didn't want to. And I love that conversation. She is like, right, you are basically the head of the household type of thing, but maybe I won't hold on to your member or whatever. I get to choose when and whether or not I'll hold your member. And I was like, oh, I love the innuendo here. And like, Jeb couldn't do anything but laugh. I thought it was kind of a cute moment between them after such a interesting conversation. So, Jeb also learned more about Brenda, because it turns out Alan actually has a criminal history. He was actually locked up, but then he was in a contempt of court for some reason. I think he was recording the judge or something like that, and that's a no-no. Going back to it, because this all started when Jenny talked about going to the wedding, and we kind of got a picture, an idea of that wedding circumstance. It's like, cool, you have oil rubbed on your private parts. Is that just the women, or do guys? I'd assume that's just the women. And some of the other wives are kind of like, yeah, that takes some getting used to. But you have Sarah. Sarah's kind of like the most extremist of it. She's kind of on the more extreme end of like being an LDS. And that brought up an interesting conversation, too, about like, oh, Brenda, she was a pretender because she was converted. So I'm like, okay, so there's even like beef between like if you were converted, because Sarah's like, oh, I keep saying Sarah, I think that was her name, Sam's wife, but it's like, because I remember both their names being S's and then having a daughter named Jenny. But it's this funny thing of, oh, I'm a real LDS woman because they were born into it, raised into it. I guess it's almost like Brenda, at the very least, we know was. I don't know if the others. She made it sound like the other wives. Some of the other wives were like that too. That they married into the family and converted. So it's almost like this thing of like, oh, but you're LDS women, but because you converted. I'm a real LDS woman, so that's why she takes it a little more. It's like, oh, I take it more serious. It's more important to me than it is to you because you're converts. So it almost tried to almost pin this like idea of there being kind of a hierarchy. But Brenda continues the conversation about women keeping their selves, keeping some free will. But then Sarah was like, anything free is kind of against God. I'm like, that's so weird. So any sort of freedom, anything that would be labeled as freedom is kind of straying from the path that God's laid out before you. So you go down that path, no questions, like there's no room for free thinking. But Brenda's kind of like, nah, that's some BS. She's been saying that's some BS. And it's also interesting, because I was about to say, like, could you count what Dan's done? Free thinking, the whole, like, no tax situation. To the point his dad found out what he was doing. It was like, oh, we went away for a little while. Now I found out we're potentially going to lose our home because you haven't paid the taxes. He was like, yeah, because should we really be paying? Like, that's the government's laws. We should be following the holy law. And his dad spun it to say, like, right, our job is to obey all laws. And his dad proceeded to pull off his belt and whip Dan's hands in front of the children, and Ron had to step up. And I love his dad's like, okay, you want to go too? You want to step to me like a man? Fine. Does, and it turns into a little bit of a fight, and Ron holds his dad back, and his dad's like, right, you have that anger in you, go count, son. And he's only doing that because someone, like a fellow member of the congregation rolled up and was like, oh, hey, is something going on you guys need? Okay, and it's like, cool, son, go count off to 10 because you've got that anger in you. I see that in your eyes. And Dan tries to play it off like everything's okay. Because while his dad was gone, he was left in charge, and he feels like no matter what, oh, I'm being punished for doing what I believe is right. But his dad is chastising him. It's like, and it's not like he's the role model with all the terrible stuff he's done. Once again, let's not forget, what did he do? Because they didn't have the responsibility, he beat a dog to death in front of them. Not the greatest role model. Once again, he's on like some very draconian level stuff. So it's almost like no wonder Dan kind of snapped from the pressure and went kind of super old school with his mentality and approach to this whole thing. And then circling back to it, I brought up earlier, Alan, he had gotten arrested because he hadn't paid any parking ticket or like some traffic taxes or something like that. So he gets arrested. Brenda confronts the rest of the family about like, shouldn't we be doing something about it? It's like, no. And Dan suggesting he's going to become sheriff. And then once he's a part of the court system, they'll have no choice but to listen to me, because this very system we're fighting against, I'll become part of it and they'll have no choice but to listen to me. I'm like, do you really think that'll be that easy? And he kind of references, what was it, Jonathan Smith or something. It's like, oh, like he chose nonviolence and went down like and tried to become president and stuff. It's like, that's how you fight the system, and that's what he was trying to do in this regard. And Brenda's like, right, so you're going to go up against like what was it, the 16th Amendment? It's like, okay, cool. So what about the other amendments? And it's like, are you going to do away with them? He's like, yeah, pretty much everything after 10. And she's like, what about 13? You know, the one that's about abolishing slavery? We going to forget about that one? She's like, come on. And the fact is, no one said anything. It's like, do they actually, like, they're speaking all this, but do they actually know all the amendments? Because they didn't have any actual rebuttal to that, you know? But then like, all Sam's rebuttal was, it's like, basically, woman, know your place. You don't get to question him about decisions he's made. And it's like, so it's like, right, make the rest of the women leave the room too. And Brenda's kind of got no choice because, like, they're all, like, sitting there and ganging up. It's mainly, I think it's Robin, Dan, and Sam that are mainly here all about that. And so there's also the interesting conversation about Alan visiting, well, I think it was more so Brenda visiting Alan, probably trying to convince him like to pay the taxes or whatever. But he's like, right, if I'm going to make these sacrifices of cutting away my family, you have to make some sacrifices too. Basically, let's have a whole bunch of babies, and that career and job you want, basically put it on hold. Which even now, Alan's like, I didn't recognize it at the time, but I was basically putting her in a cage. It's like, yeah, you're basically telling her, yeah, be a mom, be a stay-at-home mom. That's where you need to be. You got your degree, you can get a job whenever. It's like, that's not always the case. You know, it's like, right, those job opportunities can end up disappearing, especially if she gets older, especially he wants to have a ton of kids. But even Alan, present day, recognizes, like, right, I didn't realize at the time I was putting her in a cage. I thought, like, right, how messed up it is to think, oh, having children makes you holier by having a whole bunch of children. Because basically he was telling her to give up on her dreams, something she had worked so hard on for herself. She had to basically, the point is to lose your identity a bit. They might kind of try and pretty up to be like, no, you get to keep your identity. I'm going by the confines of the story. I'm not trying to like put all of Mormonism in this pigeonhole, but I'm talking about what's kind of presented in this story is, hey, you need to kind of lose your individuality, and it's about the collective, and it's more about fitting into your role as a wife. You're here to help basically placate your husband, be by his side, put him higher on the pedestal. You raise him. That's your job. That's your duty. And so it turns out Brenda had a change of heart in the moment she got pregnant. And it seems like she was her and the other, some of the other wives were working together to try and like, right, we need to save our husbands from going down this dark path, because Brenda was like, she was indicated in this family because she's like, right, I am a part of this family. I will try and save this family from itself, because she saw the dark path the family was going down. And so she was trying to change them, which Dan's not in the real mindset of changing. Sam either. Like, either there's, because later on, Robin's like, oh, my brother's like kind of not mentally there. Like, I'm wondering, is that something that's happened in like that year time frame? Was it something that was already happening? Because Sam, once again, Robin had already kind of chosen Dan's side in things. So I don't know what shifted for them. And once again, this conversation, I believe it came after Jeb had already talked to his wife about the roles and everything. And even Alan was like, oh, you don't want to ask any more questions. You don't want to know about the history of Mormonism. And it's like, oh, because did someone higher up, like the bishop, tell you to like keep it all on the shelf? And it's like, yes, those exact words. And that's what's bothering Jeb. It's like, he's trying not to show any cracks in the armor because it's his job, which I think it speaks volume that he was like, right, I'm a Mormon before I'm a cop. I was like, that's interesting. I mean, once again, I think that's the point. But it's all coming unraveled as he's learning the truth of like, oh, there's kind of a darkness here that I never realized. Because he even told the bishop, and the bishop didn't really comment on it when he was like, right, I think this murder, this double homicide I'm working on isn't kind of an outward thing. I believe it's coming from inward. The bishop made sure to shut down the conversation of looking into Mormonism's dark past. He's like, the past is the past. Don't look to it. Blah, 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 blah. But he never really gave commentary on like, oh, what if it is coming from inward? He's asking like, what are you trying to suggest and stuff like that, right? And something Sarah had said along with Sam is about basically those who are saints and those who are, tares. Basically, tares are sinners, and they basically have to be removed. And the only way to save a sinner is to basically spill their blood, which is like, right, we know that that's what happened to Brenda and her baby, is that, were their blood spilled because they were sinners. And so Sam had blood on his hand, which I think you can see later on, they were trying to examine his hands to probably like, it's like, yeah, 30 more minutes, I guess, trying to like, probably run the blood test to see whose blood it might have been, whether it's Brenda or her babies, or Brenda and her babies. So there's that. But Sam's all about it. Like, he believes, like, right, he's saying that the angels of destruction, saying that there's a list. Just like what kind of popped off with once again, I keep saying Jonathan Smith. I'm not 100% sure now. I'm terrible. There's a lot of names that kind of get thrown all at once, so I am going to confuse some names. But the leader, the one that kind of, the one we keep flashing back to when it comes to Mormonism, the person who fired that shot, potentially setting everything in motion back then, was probably considered an angel of destruction. And he was like, oh, the fact is that, but Sam is like, President, he's like, Brenda had to be stopped because she was a fornicator. And it's like, oh, she was having a relationship with someone outside of her marriage. And then Sam's like, wait, was she? And I'm like, no, we're going by your definition. He was like, no, not that type of fornication. It's like, well, what do you mean? His form of fornication was that she wasn't obeying her husband. She disobeyed her husband. And it's kind of like, oh, this, the fornication is like, oh, this impurity of like, what the marriage symbolizes. She went against it, which I love. Bill's like, that's not a definition of fornication I've ever heard. How about you? And even Jeb's like, nope, that's not one I've heard. So, because Sam is saying that, no, like, he knows that Brenda and Erica's dead. I don't think he had anything to do with it, but I think he knows. But to be fair, he might be enacting it in his head of like, oh yeah, they're dead and blah, 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 but he might not actually know that they're actually dead, or maybe he witnessed it and his mind's trying to compensate. Like, maybe his mind's broken and he's latching onto that as if he did it, but he didn't. So they end up talking to Robin about this, because he's like, now he's hearing like, wait, Brenda and Erica are dead. It's like, yes. He's like, I know you're trying to convince my brother to do it. It's like, your brother, we didn't even have to say anything. Your brother pretty much confessed to doing it. So they talk about a list, a hit list. And it's basically anyone that wouldn't allow them to look in, anyone that is basically, what's the word I'm looking for? Basically stifling any looking into the past. I'm assuming it's suggesting that Dan wanted to look more into the the past and stuff. And so, which I didn't talk about it. That scene where Dan was like, I would do anything to go anywhere. And he gets his family to repeat. He's doing it. And at first I was like, oh, is it kind of supposed to be like, now it's kind of lively. And then you look look on his face. It's so distorted. And he's almost about to break down. He's like, I will do anything. I will go anywhere. And he's like, oh, the Lord, I feel that burning inside me. I know I'll enact your role. I'll be the chosen one. Like, he looked very disturbed in that moment. Like, he's just like begging, please. You know, in that moment, he just seemed off. He seemed off for a while. Once again, the pressures of the position kind of being thrust upon him, and what it's kind of done not only to him, but this entire family. But essentially, their list also includes the bishop, because he was also the same one trying to shut Jeb down. There's a couple other people. It's like, cool, Jeb and Bill go to try and check on different people. I think they're going to try and check on the bishop, as well as, because the bishop's name is like Lowe's, and another family, the Stows. Like, anyone that would try and stop them from learning about the past, they have to try and protect them, because they might be on the list. Like, once again, there are 3 Laffertys and their respective families, their wives and their children, that are unaccounted for. So they don't know. Because also, once again, we don't know about their mom and dad. Their mom and dad might be gone. Or maybe their dad is and their mom's still on. I don't know. But at the very least, that's still people out there that could be potentially continuing this and trying to, you know, like, think there's like some holy righteousness behind them killing these people who are impeding any means of learning about their past and kind of becoming whole. Because the moment they learn about the past, there's probably a good chance they might try and repeat it. I mean, the foundations have already kind of been laid out, because once again, Dan, Sam, and Ron and everything, maybe Robin rather, all like latched up with like some like they're fighting militarization, but it's like they believe like the police are like this militarized unit, which I could see that perspective, but I'm also like, the people you're rolling with are these, like, you know, aren't they kind of the same ilk as well? So I don't know, some fascinating things. I'm ultimately really curious to ultimately see where the next episode takes us going forward with all of this. But really, that's all I'm going to talk about. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day, and goodbye.